Thank all of our sponsors, Witham, Caldwell IP, Chen PR, Hamilton, Brooks, Smith Reynolds, Morse, Barnes, Brown, and Pendleton, and Wolf Greenfield. We cannot do this without our sponsors, and we also can't do it without our volunteers. And tonight's program was actually driven by our Innovation Series Committee, and more specifically by tonight's moderator, Phil, from Patient Keeper. So Phil, thank you so much for your leadership, and with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Sounds good. Thanks again, everybody. This panel came together, out of kind of a labor of love for a bunch of people over the past 6 months or so. I was fortunate enough to join the Innovation Committee this past winter, and really had some great collaboration along the way, and was connected with some really fantastic folks, and obviously continuing to work with some folks I worked with in the past, in Dr. Bickle. But again, my name is Phil Machnik from Patient Keeper. I work supporting HCA, which is the largest healthcare organization in the country. And Patient Keeper's platform is an EHR accelerator that helps providers do their job well. Before Patient Keeper, I actually worked at Boston Children's Hospital with Dr. Bickle for about 12 years, working on their electronic health platform. And I was supporting the ambulatory space, the emergency department, and kind of everything in between during that time. So yeah.
And they're still standing.
Yeah. Yeah, I must have done okay. So yeah, Dan, take it away.
Sure. So I'm Dan Malloy. I'm a patent attorney at Wolf Greenfield. Prior to sort of engaging in an IP career, I was an engineer. So undergrad and sort of master's, I was doing computer science and math. Then I worked in missile defense for a number of years at MIT Lincoln Laboratory. And after that, I went to Harvard and did my doctoral work in sort of statistics, statistical modeling, a lot of things that are today called by different things like machine learning and data science, and apply that to sort of speech processing problems and other things. And after that, I came to Wolf Greenfield, where I've been for the last 8 years. We are fairly large IP-only law firm. We have over 130 professionals. I'm in a group of about 35 people that focus on electrical and computer technology, and my practice in large part focuses on working with clients in the AI space, machine learning space, signal processing, and really glad to be here to talk about, I think, a quite relevant topic.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Katherine. I first came to Boston in 2011 as a Fulbright scholar to do my postdoctoral fellowship in socio-biostatistics, for lack of a better word. I did my
school where we provided computer vision image analysis support for a broad range of researchers doing basic research and some clinical research there as well. And then more recently moved to PathAI, where now I lead a team of ML engineers and ML scientists who are scaling up what we do and developing new tools to try to improve healthcare and drug development by improving pathology.
And good evening. I'm John Bickle. I usually introduce myself as a father, informatician, and clinician, born, raised, and trained at Pittsburgh. So medical school and residency, pediatric residency there, as well as informatics master's degree out of UPitt. Came to Boston Children's in 2010 and have had a whole variety of roles, everything from the director of clinical research informatics all the way through to what I'm doing today, which is a combination of the director of the clinical health record, so our electronic health record, business intelligence, library, archives, and database administration. So a wide variety of things I'm doing. And I'm a practicing clinician, so I had a patient call just at 5 o'clock this evening. So.
Excellent, thanks guys. So to kind of kick it off, I wanted to talk about how artificial intelligence means a lot of things to a lot of people. So I think it's important for us to kind of get a perspective on, actually I want to start with Hunter, to talk about how would you describe artificial intelligence to someone new to the field, someone an amateur in the field, and kind of why it's important to healthcare.
Yeah, and I think just to preface this, I think it is important to recognize how broadly this term is used, right? And I'll try to give a relatively simple answer, but I think when anyone tells you they're going to sort of solve something with AI, you should always ask more questions, right? That is as broad as saying I'm going to solve something with medicine, right? There's not enough detail there. If I try to speak broadly enough that it can encompass what people often mean when they refer to that, or when they use this term, I think a lot of it really boils down to pattern recognition. So learning both from data and either in a supervised or unsupervised way, existing patterns, or learning to relate certain inputs to certain outputs, right? And while that may not sound as exciting as this sort of complex reasoning process that the term AI might conjure in your brain when you hear it, I think that is actually pretty closely related to what humans do when they learn, right? So we learn that the furry thing with whiskers people call a cat, and the furry thing with a tail that wags people call a dog, right? And that's correlating a pattern, a visual stimuli pattern, with a speech pattern and a language pattern, right? And that is what much of modern AI can be described as, I would say.
Great. So why is AI the tool that people are trying to apply to healthcare? And Katherine, I'd like to start with you on this one.
Okay, so I think I think AI gets packaged very commonly with prediction. And I feel like this is where the magic sort of is, everybody expects to happen, is that it will be able to predict better. And in many ways, AI can predict better. At least they use different methodology than our current methodology. And so there's a lot of expectation that it will help improve prediction for disease, for diagnosis, for prognosis. I think in healthcare we have a lot of expectations in how it will help prediction primarily. But it will also help in so many areas. I mean, it's just exploding. Even the things that I know Google is up to is pretty in-depth and way out there, way outside the box. Gathering information about us from like a contact lens, or something very inintrusive to our lives to help predict when our blood sugar is going to spike, or if we're walking too slowly, if we're about to have a cardiac event, if our rheumatoid is going to flare up. There's a lot of hype in being able to predict these things from a broad range of like me, the individual, to studying diseases at a big population level to be able to predict trends better as well.
Just to build on that answer, and actually the first one too, right? When people talk about AI today, they tend to think about machine learning, and one of the ways that you can, I'm not going to define it, but you could think about machine learning is that's a subpart of AI where you're really trying to use data to make predictions. And the more data you have, the better predictions you can make, or at least you can measure how much better you got. And one of the reasons I think that this whole area is quite applicable in medicine is there's a lot of data. There's a lot more data today than there was 20 years ago. And even if you had all the same professionals working very hard and they're all excellent, you can't get through it. And so when you have technology in pattern recognition that can sift through large volumes of data in an automated way and reasonably pull out the things that perhaps are relevant, even if it can't reason with them, then that is a good reason for why it's applicable and of interest in healthcare.
You make an excellent point, because I think we're at this crux now in history because so much of our health information has been digitized. And because it has, now we can do different things with it. And so this is where I think the magic has happened.
So, John, I'm interested in your perspective on kind of what Katherine and Dan touched upon, which is kind of emerging technologies or new innovations just in healthcare in general, and maybe folks that are looking to get into this space as investors, as engineers, entrepreneurs, whichever. What are some trends in healthcare that people should be paying attention to now and really looking to incorporate into this space?
Trends. Can I go back for just one second and say, I like your idea of pattern recognition. I think a lot of ultimately what we train ourselves as clinicians to do is do pattern recognition in the medical space. If you could indulge me for just 1 second, this was brought home to me yesterday. So I was in clinic yesterday. if you get a knock on the door from another clinician, you have to step out for some reason. So one of the nurses pulled me out of a room and said, "Could you just take a look at this patient? There's something not right about this patient." And this patient had a very rare syndrome, to be honest with you. This is a syndrome I had heard of once in my life, didn't know much about it. But this nurse had a pattern recognition to what she was looking at. She was looking at a patient who didn't look right, her color didn't look right, her vital signs didn't look right, she was sweating, and coupled with this syndrome, we had to actually send this child to the emergency department. Actually, she's in the ICU tonight. So, that kind of pattern recognition is really, really important. And, in terms of trends, that patient, when she got to the emergency department, once there was some data, the sepsis trigger fired, right? So we'll talk about this at some point. Yeah. But Phil was instrumental in developing a sepsis trigger here at Boston Children's. So there's a crawler that looks through all the data, looks at the data and says, this might be sepsis, go and evaluate the patient. Now I'll tell you, this trigger, this kid had sepsis. I told the ER the kid had sepsis. She got there, she got on the sepsis protocol before the computer ever fired the alert, right? Way before the computer ever fired the alert. And so in terms of emerging trends, what I think the biggest trend in healthcare as it relates to AI is we're still looking at trying to crunch all the data and trying to develop these patterns and trying to develop the knowledge base for us to be able to take actionable measures against. So we're pretty early on in this journey.
Yeah. And I think you had access to a lot more information than this algorithm did, right? You're
Absolutely.
Using a combination of visual stimuli, the behavior and the intonation of the nurse as she describes a patient to you even gives you indirect evidence about her experience with the patient. There's a lot of multifactorial information that goes into your ability to make that call that much faster than when the small number of features that actually made it to the algorithm triggered the same classification.
Yeah.
I'd love to elaborate on that algorithm in particular, because that's something that Boston Children's was instrumental in developing, right? And I think that's kind of an early example of it's not truly machine learning, but it's following an algorithm, and you made that pediatric specific, and it's something that requires all sorts of data but also operational process along the way. Since that's been implemented, because it's been about a year now at this point, do you think that the outcome of that very, very basic level machine learning has improved the overall sepsis attestation, or have you caught more patients that you would not have normally caught?
I think it's the edge cases. So it's not that clinicians weren't finding sepsis. Right. But I think it's these edge cases where perhaps clinicians weren't as attentive as they should be, or it's a busy place with multiple stimuli and 100 million data points coming at you all the time. So right. The opportunity for something that won't ever have a bad day unless the network's down, isn't influenced by the fact that someone just called them and gave them some bad news, or their kid's sick and they're really not thinking about work as much as they are worried about their kid at home. So something that is always attentive and can always recognize that pattern 100% of the time. That's going to be where I think in the near term we can really have some wonderful gains and actually help the clinician along, right?
Yeah, and I mean we see that as well at PathAI. Pathologists are very good at looking at a sample of tissue and telling you the diagnosis, and it doesn't take them very long to do that. But what we can do is look at every single cell, all 200,000 to maybe 1 million cells on a single slide, and assess every one of them, right? And that's the difference there with being able to be exhaustive and not miss a patch because we're processing all of them.
Yeah. I think that kind of sequences into what my next question was going to be, which is, does this type of technology can it act as a bridge for a skilled workforce? you have some parts of the country that don't have as many clinicians or highly skilled clinicians in the same capacity that we do here in Boston, or access to technology in the same capacity. So could this act as a kind of first line of defense for a lot of patients in rural areas or lower income areas of the country? Kind of open that up to the group, but maybe Katherine, it looks like you were.
Yeah, I'm actually working on a project in Canada where we have an outreach for heart failure patients, and they're wearing some wearables, some just Fitbits, type iWatch things, and we're monitoring their steps, and that information's coming to us if there's like a change in their regular pattern. And from there, we contact them to see what's going on. Did you fall? Did you, hurt your knee? Or is this really some event where now we're seeing that, water is pooling and they're about to have some kind of, readmission type event for their heart failure? So we're working on that currently right now. In the past, we were using like a telehealth kind of check-in, but with this, it's just so quick. And if there's a flag that comes up, it comes up in the algorithm, you contact the person immediately, it's just very quick. And going back to the sepsis example, sepsis, for the audience that's not in the medical field, is really something where time is of the essence. And it's an infection, it can rip through the body really quickly, you can die from it. And so it's really important in a lot of these conditions to have something that works very quickly and efficiently. And I feel like now this is something that can help us and be a good adjunct to our care.
In terms of I'm going to send it right back to you on that point, but can you talk a little bit about, just because not everybody here works in the hospital, not everybody here works on an EHR, can you describe a little bit of what actually it takes from a lift standpoint for you to get that data into the system? Because I think talking about time of the essence, what's the experience like?
So I'd say the experience is not optimal. So from a physician standpoint, right, I'm not entering in the vital signs, I'm not entering in some of the core bits of information. Mostly what I'm doing is I'm using a glorified word processor to either type in or dictate in, sort of a clinical narrative of what's going on, my thoughts, and potentially at the end some orders to move forward. So, hey, you need some blood work. Hey, you need an ultrasound. Hey, you need an X-ray. That's to the extent to which I'm doing my work. Ahead of that, oftentimes, it's no more than different forms. Form A says, hey, put in your blood pressure and heart rate for the patient. Another form says, have you asked the patient, do they feel safe at home? Another form says, what do they look like, right? Are they comfortable, not comfortable? Do they have pain? Do they not have pain? So the context of the patient, if we talk about the sepsis algorithm and why it was so delayed compared to my eyes or then the nurse's eyes, is because those algorithms and anything that's artificially intelligent beyond that doesn't have the real-time context as much as we would want. If we could give some sort of AI machine learning algorithm real-time context in the moment, I'm sure that system and I would come up with, hey, this kid has some sort of sepsis physiology, we should think about it in the moment. I reviewed that in my head last night. Had I not been paying attention, had I not at that moment sort of kind of put a couple things together and not had the nurse sort of nudge me and say, I don't know about this, I wouldn't have necessarily picked that up. It was subtle, to be honest with you. In retrospect, it was blindingly obvious, but in the moment, you could imagine a clinician missing it and letting the child, go home.
And bridging to a skill or lack of a skilled workforce, let's take South America and let's assume it's not blanketed with Boston Children's Hospitals, right?
Yeah.
What are you going to do? You're going to get your AI algorithm on a CD-ROM and just populate it all over the continent? No, you actually need an infrastructure that, yes, maybe you have a computer running somewhere that has access to some of the sort of latest kind of algorithmics and smarts, but unless you are able to operated in an infrastructure where the right data points are coming in. Like I walk into, MGH emergency room, there's going to be a lot of data worked up on me very, very quickly. And it's going to be of a high quality, right? But garbage in, garbage out. If the right inputs aren't there, the algorithms aren't going to work. And so a lot of the clients we work with that think about expanding their markets beyond sort of the, high density, top-notch medical areas in the US, think about products that aren't simply an AI algorithm, a machine learning algorithm. Maybe it's a device that has a sensor capacity. It's gathering some information. You can stratify and predict what kind of information is going to be gathered and how you can act upon it. Because without it, it's just, for lack of a better word, just math.
That's great. You jumped right into exactly what I was going to ask you, which is kind of talking about that landscape. So you talked about wearables, you talked about gathering data on the patient. With your perspective on the industry, are you already seeing anything exciting in the market that's gathering data that people might not be aware of yet? I mean, the Apple Watch is a big one that everyone is seeing these days, but what else is in the marketplace that might be, again, bridging the gap between a clinician or at least gathering some data that might normally only be gathered in a top hospital in the country?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the miniaturization. So maybe you don't have an ultrasound device that's just like a giant cart, right? A lot of the, your Siemens, your Phillips, they're all developing, like mini ultrasound devices that you could potentially get the cost low enough that you could send it, to a third world country or a sort of a rural setting and get some initial data gathered that you can act upon. So it's really the advances in that technology that drive it, as opposed to I have this amazing algorithm for using deep neural nets to interpret an ultrasound image in like better than an ultrasound technician can, right? So it's that kind of stuff. It's kits for collecting blood samples. It's in being able to do rapid sequencing and getting all kinds of omics data that you can analyze. I think the trends are there, right? If there was a way to get an awesome pathology sample, right, a tissue sample, that would mean something very different for your business than simply saying, all right, well, I'm going to service the 3 hospitals here in Longwood and get their nice slides and kind of do vision on that.
Yeah, they're extremely high resolution slides, right? What do you do with a low res slide that someone emailed you? Hopefully they're not emailed you.
Yes. They tweeted a link, right? Yeah, no, I mean, I think that this is certainly a limitation in pathology as well, right? The slide needs to be digitized. And I think to some extent the reason that the technology to digitize pathology has not become as widespread as it could have, as it has been in like radiology, for example, is because there hasn't really been a killer app that provides the incentive to encourage people to really digitize it. A clinician needs to see the worth in digitizing that slide before they're going to go to that trouble, when standard pathology practice does not require that, right? And when you provide that, then that technology will get cheaper. It'll be easier to disseminate to less resource-rich areas, right? There has also been some research that at least proof of concepts of small little lenses you can attach to the camera on your smartphone that lets you take images usually without stain in the field and identifies things like parasites and stuff like that. So there are some applications that aren't the sort of full clinical workup that you might get at MGH or Children's, but that can produce data in these kind of areas.
And I feel like we're somewhat tiptoeing around it, but I feel like we're treating data as a 4-letter word, which is, in this case, it probably is because the standardization's not there across these institutions. Hunter, I might continue with you. I'm interested in your perspective on how you plan to approach partnering with a Boston Children's or, small healthcare organizations or large vendors that are getting into this space or even research institutions. How do you see that partnership forming?
You mean in terms of like the variability in the data, or
just you need his data and you need his data, and it goes on and on, right?
Right.
And
just to give you context, Boston Children's still works on analog slides.
Right.
So that's what I'm getting at is what are the barriers to get through here for all of you guys to be really kind of sharing the same nomenclature to really address this at scale approach?
Yeah, I mean, we have had to invest in purchasing our own side scanners in order to make sure that that's not a barrier, right? If somebody has, if one of our partners has data that we believe we can add value to, we don't want the inability to digitize it to be the limiting factor, right? So that's something I think in terms of like unstructured data and heterogeneity in pathology, we're maybe a little bit spoiled. There's a finite number of image formats, and it's relatively straightforward for us to set up a ingestion pipeline that will let us work with pretty much data from any type of scanner. You do have variability in data produced in different locations, and that certainly is an open problem in the field, is how best to handle. The histology that comes out of Children's looks a little bit different than that comes out of the Brigham, that comes out of MGH, and the models need to make sure that these models are exposed to all that variability to be sure that they can handle it when deployed in the wild.
Dan,
Beyond the images, if you're going to get any context for that image, right, the clinical context, you're going to have to read some of my data, right? You're going to have to get some more than just the image. The problem with that right now is that more than 70% of all the data that we have at our institution is in text format. That is essentially not usable unless you really throw a lot of NLP at it.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, I think in the context of retrospective analysis of clinical trials, luckily a lot of that data is more structured. But you're right that in a more clinical setting, a lot of that metadata about the patient would be extremely useful to inform any diagnosis or prognosis that comes out of one of our algorithms. And that is absolutely a barrier to integrating that additional information.
Yeah, and that's a challenge for all you guys out here. Unlock that data that's there. And I'm not just saying just NLP, but there is a whole lot of information retrospectively. Yes, we've digitized things over the last 20 years, but we've digitized them and locked them in a Word file essentially. So good luck, right? The rest, yes, you have maybe some good billing data, maybe you have some average billing data, maybe you have a lab or two here and there, but the real meat, the real clinical context is locked away. So good luck.
Dan, can you talk a little bit about the legal implications of this problem?
Sure. I mean, so I hear that every time we work with somebody because they've built some interesting AI system or ML thing, and where was 99% of the work? It wasn't getting all the data cleaned up. And so when we sort of think about intellectual property and sort of legal implications, and if a company starts, what did it develop? What is its sort of core IP? In the machine learning space, a lot of it is around the data that they built and the data that they contracted and licensed and got access to, right? Because maybe I know all the algorithms that Hunter is using to sort of process the pathology images, but I can't train neural networks to do what his neural networks do without access to his data. So it's a real big asset in sort of the machine learning technology world. And when we think about intellectual property strategy, there's sort of the usual things, patents and trade secrets and trademarks and all wonderful things. But when you're in this space, data is king, and relationships and partnerships with labs at hospitals and research institutions is key. Just as an anecdote, one sort of tussle in a negotiation that often happens when a company like PathAI will come to a hospital like Brigham. I'm going to stop using Boston Children's. I'm going to start using every other hospital I can think of. But the one question is, well, can we get your data? Well, what do you need our data for? Well, we would like to train our algorithms to do X. Well, okay. So then if they do that, and their algorithm now, based on these data they ingested, works 15% better, who owns the improved algorithm? Is it these guys because they did the work? Is it Brigham because they provided the data? So there's a lot of legal issues and wrangling when you're setting up a startup to kind of understand who's going to do what. And that's a pretty hot topic.
Where in a startup's life cycle do they need to consider that? Because healthcare is a difficult enough space to get in for any technology project, but when you're thinking about this, where it requires patient data, real patient data, where should they be getting into the weeds with the legal side of things?
What we always like to say, as early as possible. Right, but realistically, what you're talking about is, it's not really a technical question. It's really how do you want your business to succeed question. You have to have a plan for this, right? You have to think about how you, sure, you can play with smaller data sets. But if you're going to scale, if you're going to convince people to invest in what you're building, you need to have a pathway to that. Yep. So yeah, I think on day one, need to be thinking of, okay, if I'm making a kind of an AI play, where am I going to get the data sets that's going to make my sort of innovations run? Without real data, you're just doing toy examples. So I think right away.
Yeah, and I think to just to reinforce that point, I mean, this is machine learning is a notoriously open field in terms of publication, right? It's all the publications are open access, and source code is provided fairly consistently. And in part, the reason that companies like Google and Facebook are willing to publish that is because of what you alluded to earlier, is that you can have their method, but you will not be able to match their performance without the proprietary data sets they have, right? And I think this is something that's often underappreciated by the outside world, how valuable the data is itself rather than just this magical algorithm.
I experience that all the time with companies that want to work with Boston Children's. Just give us your data. We'll make magic happen. Just give us the data. Come on. Give us the data.
Frenzy.
Right.
Katherine, I'd love to hear your approach to, you have clinical trials across numerous organizations.
Yeah, I do. And so I had stars in my eyes when I started. And I remember I walked into Brigham, and this is for real. And I said, well, can I have access to your EMR? I'm looking at heart disease and gender differences in men and women, and I'm really interested if you could share with me the EMR. And so the conversation, it started off pretty positive, and then it kind of went down a very, very slippery slope very, very quickly. And so data is actually very hard to acquire, and the IT department, and there was legal issues at the time, and it was just really difficult. But then when I actually took a look at what was in the EMR, I thought, oh goodness, exactly what you were saying before. I was like, there's no way I can turn all this text into something meaningful. I need an army of people that's just going to help me with this. And so I thought, I can't do this. So I collect my own data. I collect every single piece of data myself. I own all of my data, and it's really the way I can kind of work with this. I'm hoping that in the future I'll be able to ramp up, but right now I'm collecting all of my own data.
If you have any narrative data, you're somehow also tagging it with metadata, so you know what the variables you.
Yeah. And so everything,
That's
all
nice
of my.
And clean.
Yeah, it's clean. And so it's structured, it's clean. They literally input everything. It goes directly into the spreadsheet the way I want it. When we transcribe it, it all goes into an XML file. So everything's all ready for analysis. But I didn't want to waste my time in trying to fix all of this data. It's a problem. It's not usable right now.
Hunter, I'd love to hear about how PathAI is generating outcomes from kind of machine-driven results, right? From what I understand, the staging of cancer is something that you guys have gotten into and have been rethinking because of outcomes from your algorithms. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so not only staging of cancer and detection, but also prognosis, and something we're interested in more recently is treatment selection. Right? Is predicting whether a particular compound is appropriate for a certain patient. And there's a sort of a combination of approaches we can use strong biomedical priors to talk to some pathologists and clinicians and say, these are the things you should be looking for in these slides. And then we can develop models that will exhaustively quantify those and extract human interpretable features from them, and then combine those to try to make a prediction. And then there are also more data-driven approaches that really say, we have some outcome information about this patient. We know what their survival time was, or what arm of this clinical trial they were in. And then can we then extract from the data features in a completely end-to-end data-driven way, features that will reproduce that outcome, and then you can learn from that. In addition to getting a prediction, you can also try to learn from that things that might be actually informative to clinicians, right? Features that they may not have thought of that were predictive.
Yeah, the term that comes up a lot these days is precision medicine. When we think about exactly what you just described. Some people roll their eyes, but some people are like, yeah, but either way, that's kind of what we're getting at, is thinking about what is the precise care pathway for that patient, right? So with your outcomes, something that wasn't necessarily ushered through by a clinician running a patient through trials in the same normal traditional format, my question would be to Dr. Bickle, if someone were to present these outcomes to you, what's your interpretation? How likely is a clinician to start adopting that care pathway without running it through a real patient?
Yeah, this is the 1-inch problem. I think as clinicians, maybe I'm an old fuddy-duddy. I'm 40 years old, so just as long as this forum's been going on. So maybe I'm an old fuddy-duddy here. But I think most clinicians would approach sort of a naive algorithm like this with a lot of suspicion, without some sort of trial-backed proof that this approach works. Mm-hmm. And even then, I think if you put truth serum in all those clinicians, I think they would be pretty still suspicious of the whole gamut. In the BI space, we've been doing lots of prediction modeling to try and help clinicians better care for their patients. And you can provide them all the data, all the evidence for why you think that your algorithm is good. Your AUC curve is huge, and look, I'm precisely predicting exactly what's happening in reality. They still will treat that with a lot of suspicion.
Dan, I'm thinking about the risk and the responsibility that puts on the hospital, right? So writing up any sort of agreement between the patient and the provider, and then the technology, like how do we see that manifesting in the years to come as more of these models are kind of recommending pathways for their patients?
Yeah, I don't see that coming anytime soon. Just to echo your words, right? Because maybe it's a good assistive tool, but Hunter and I were chatting. I said, what if we replace all the Dr. Bickles in the world and we just run all the pathologists in the world and we run your algorithms? I guess the concern is everybody would sue them.
Yeah.
I don't know that there's any get around it, but I just don't think the technology is there yet. There's a lot of talk in the popular literature, articles. Everybody's getting replaced. Everybody's, irrelevant. I just don't think the truth could be any further from that statement.
Yeah.
The technology is in its infancy.
Yep.
It's, it's pattern recognition. It's processing of data, but we're talking about replacing people is just sort of a science fiction thing.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, if Hunter's technology says, hey, Dr. Bickle, here are the 3 top diagnoses that, based on our image analysis, that you should consider, I would really appreciate it as a clinician to say, oh, you know what, number 1, number 2, yeah, I was thinking of that too. But this third one, that's something that I hadn't thought about. That's interesting. Show me the evidence of why you're thinking diagnosis number 3. That is something that is much more close to what clinicians, I think, would be willing to accept. A sort of a trusted colleague. I mean, that's just like calling a consult. I have this slide in front of me. I don't know what it is. I've not seen this. Go call the old pathologist who's practically in retirement, who's seen 1 million slides, to come and say, yeah, maybe have you considered X diagnosis? That's okay. Yeah. As long as the top 3 diagnoses are not a complete zebra, right?
Yeah, right. And I think part of the reason you might be accepting of that is because if he said something that was a zebra, right, you could ask him why.
Why?
Right?
Yeah.
And he could, in most cases, give you some sort of reasons. Well, I saw this, this, or this, and I think that's certainly an area where the field has not done enough, has not been diligent enough in making sure that predictions are accompanied by sort of interpretable outputs, right? So you can argue all day about what explanation is, but the fact that these things are seen as black boxes and mysterious is I would argue in large part why people are so suspicious, right? And adding interpretability will help, and also I think adding rigorous validation that is well described, that you can really go through with the fine-tooth comb and understand, okay, what is the evidence that this algorithm is not going to fail? Why should I test this? Which is what you look for in a new drug you might give a patient, that you want to look at the clinical trial and understand how it was controlled and what the results were, and that's how you know to trust it, even if you may not know exactly the mechanism of action of that particular compound.
Yeah.
I'm going to be a little bit provocative here. And I'm going to say that in medicine, we use often a very shotgun approach. And we have very large buckets, shall we say, of how we classify people and diseases and therapies for them. And I'm hoping that with precision medicine today is largely a term that's used to describe genomics and how we're going to see your genetic profile, and if we can, like, cater some kind of treatment based on your genetics. But I think that there's a whole field beyond genetics out there. And in the clinical trial world, we have something called the large, simple, randomized controlled trial, which we try to have criteria that's super broad, that we can have lots of people enter the criteria of this trial, so that way we can determine if this therapy works or not. And, but we don't have all the nuances of all the people and the subtyping of the people and the classifications. And I really am hopeful in the future, in the near future, that these algorithms will be able to subtype people much more quickly and efficiently than our current strategies allow us to.
Right, and I think another thing to keep in mind there is that there's, when an algorithm is attempting to do something that you can already do very well, right, and that you understand the process that goes into making that decision, that's sort of qualitatively different from it providing you with new insight that you didn't have before, right, and taking two different patients that might have looked identical to you and saying, actually, there might be a difference between these two, right?
Right.
And when you're providing new information, then I think that shows people the value maybe a little bit more clearly than just doing the same thing slightly faster or cheaper or something. Right?
And so just to carry on with this, we have our large, simple, randomized controlled trials, and they largely consist of people who are able to take some time off during the middle of the day of their work to go in for their clinical appointment. And so what we end up doing is we end up missing a lot of the poor population because it could be threatening for their job. And so we don't actually know how these drugs work in a lot of the people that we would call, where we see our health disparities. These are mostly people that are poor, and or they don't have the same access, or they don't have the same accessibility to the care that people are receiving in the clinical trial. And because of this, all of our therapies are actually, we know if they work or not in these populations, the ones that are coming in, that we're basing our statistical results. It's literally who are composing the data of the algorithms. But we actually don't know what a lot of this stuff works in different regions of the world, or even in our own backyard. We have no idea. We just use this. This is why I call it the shotgun approach. We're like, it works for the majority. We hope it works for you too. And it may not. We really have no insight on that at all.
I just want to pick up on a point you made, which is if you're starting a company and you're trying to sort of pitch your idea and you have an AI or machine learning thing, there are lots of people who are going to want to know, why is your thing awesome? Why does it work? Right? It's not just a problem for a clinician getting a particular prediction. Like any kind of problem you're trying to solve, you need to convince investors. You're going to need to convince, potential partners who you want to partner with, and so forth. And most of those people don't know the detailed math. Most of those people don't really understand what it is that you're doing beyond a few kind of keywords. And so sort of, putting the entrepreneur hat on, you really have to think about how do you explain what it is that you've made, why does it work, and hopefully be able to build it in such a way that does provide some explanation, if possible, of why the successes are what they are and where the failures could be.
I have a couple questions to follow up on both of you guys, but I'm going to start with Katherine. I'm going to go back to the example you gave of people not being able to provide information, but how about people who choose not to provide information? So thinking about privacy in this space too, especially in this country, people are more apt to not want to share their data, where overseas in other countries, where we do see burgeoning AI markets, people, they don't have the choice to hide their data. So kind of elaborate a little bit on privacy in this space.
Yeah, the privacy issue is really, I think Dan would probably know more on this one, but I feel like there's a lot of question as to who owns the data. So for example, a friend of mine who has a device, a cardiac device, wants to get her cardiac data, and the company will not give it to her. But it's her data. She is generating it, and she is an analyst herself, and she would like to analyze her own data. and she has no accessibility. So who owns the data? She has this device. She has no choice in like being able to, this is life and death for her. So this is a real tricky area as to who owns the data. And then in the clinical trial, okay, I'm running the clinical trial, I'm collecting all of my own data, but I'm very careful that I can't use any of the Brigham's data. I can only use my data. And I have to collect it in a format for the way that I've designed it. So I'm the owner of the data, but it becomes very difficult to navigate afterwards, or to explain to a patient that I have gone through extreme measures to provide security of your data. It is completely de-identified. Everything you say will remain confidential. You're free to withdraw at any single time, even after, I've decided, the trial is long done, and you say for whatever reason you have mistrust, I have to take out your data from my models. So there are some precautions right now and protections that are largely based from the pharma world, to be honest. And we're sort of extending them and adapting them for the technology world that we're living in right now with all of the data privacy issues. But I really don't feel like we have a good grasp of that in the hospitals, and that's probably why they're so reluctant to share EMRs. Dan?
Yeah.
Let me be provocative in the other way. Of course, privacy law is complicated and surely not caught up to everything that's going on. But in some sense, there is some safety in numbers, right? Where we need, so you sort of described an example where it's a single person, it's that single person data. But when you're talking about machine learning and AI, you need a lot of data. And so there's, at least from a technological perspective, feel like there's got to be a way that sort of the anonymization and sort of de-identification techniques that we have now can be used to somewhat safely hide your individuality, your individual characteristics if you're, getting 50,000 pathology samples or something like that. Whether that's in fact, true and whether people trust the system, that's a whole separate thing. We've all signed a, oh yeah, very complicated protocols, except a week later I get a letter saying, oh, we're sorry, your data was compromised and stolen, and your credit card numbers are everywhere. And so I think the technology is there to implement this right. I don't think the trust in that technology exists much. We spoke briefly about fast MRI and the kind of the Facebook stuff. Do we really trust Facebook with all of our MRI images? Well, I guess, beyond the fact that a lawyer has a brain, I'm not too worried about them knowing anything about me, but that was a surprise to me. And there's some safety in numbers, and so it's okay. But yeah, do I trust Facebook? No.
They're going to add microtransactions to reading your tests.
Right.
So you made a great point earlier about, you were talking about the actual vetting a product in this space is not as simple as saying, I would buy that. You have to really kind of understand a lot more than just kind of basic off the street, anybody to really invest in this space. From your perspective, is there any way that someone who's cutting the check or someone who's building a team in this space can really either bolster their own skills, or what types of things should they understand if they want to, at kind of at a baseline level, before they invest in a machine learning product?
You mean what they should learn about the company, or what they should sort of take into consideration when investing?
More about the technology itself.
Okay.
Should they understand the technology deeper than, let's say, blockchain, or let's say, just a basic social media app or a fintech app? Do you think this space requires a higher level of knowledge to invest in?
You know what? If I had $30 million and needed to invest in somebody, I would want to invest it in those that are able to articulate to me, regardless of what my background is, why their product is amazing. Why they can. I mean, you guys watch Shark Tank? You think these guys actually know anything? They have a ton of money, and they make some good bets, and sometimes they're wrong and sometimes they're right. You think Mark Cuban's going to go learn about blockchain, quantum dots, or like whatever, AI? No. I think the burden, if you're trying to, again, from the perspective of an entrepreneur, if you're trying to secure investment, I think the burden's on you.
Right.
You're not going to say, oh, you know what, I'm sorry. You have a lot of money. You don't really understand what you're saying. Why don't you go take a class and then come back and talk to me? I just don't think the world works like that.
Yeah, that's good.
I'd say on the other side of that coin, the burden, so let's say you get your $30 million and now you're trying to put this in the hospital. The burden is not only to articulate why this might be good, but also how you're gonna integrate in with the hospital system. That's where we see a lot of companies fail, is not have a really great plan about how to get this at the point of care, right at the bedside, right in the clinician workflow. And for better, for worse, and it's mostly for worse, EHRs are pretty monolithic and pretty protective of the clinician workflow. To be honest with you, clinicians don't have a whole heck of a lot of time to be dealing with doodads and gadgets and pop-ups and things that are sort of outside. The fact that I'm sitting in clinic, I have to evaluate this patient in less than 15 minutes, write their note, and get them out the door because I have a line of patients to see next. So if you're a company that has your VC backing, you have to think long and hard about how you're going to interdigitate into the clinician workflow right at the point of care.
Yeah, and I think that's something that certainly, having been in academia prior to PathAI, as a change in the way I think about these problems, right? Whereas in academia, it's like you figure out, you solve the problem, you publish the paper, it's done. And the reality is that deploying and scaling these systems is maybe the vast majority of the challenge, right? So you manage to do something well on the first 200 slides that you happen to get your hands on, and now somebody says, oh, you did a great job on that, here's 10,000 slides, do it again, right? And suddenly you can't do it on the GPU workstation you built yourself that's sitting in the back corner of the office, right? So you need not just more hardware, but you need machinery around that lets you move data around in an efficient way. And you know, that's why that even though PathAI is an ML company, we're not even half ML people, right? There's a lot of engineers and product designers and front-end designers that make this thing actually feasible.
So what is that? I know there's not a magic wand, but what is the makeup of a team, an early stage team? What does that need to be? Because I think you can probably guess, but I'd love to hear your perspective on what a successful team in this space would look like.
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak from the one example. Yeah, and I think who we had at the beginning was, you know, we had sort of one person that was relatively an expert in a particular area, either engineering, front end or back end, or the clinical side. Or one of our co-founders, Andrew Beck, is a pathologist, or the machine learning. The other co-founder is a PhD in machine learning from MIT. But you can't just have a bunch of experts. You need people that are flexible, and because somebody's going to have to get on Amazon and order new chairs and put the desks together when they arrive, right? So you need people who know their area but are flexible and can learn and can expand outside of it. And then as you grow from there, you recognize where the bottleneck is currently, and you add people to that area so that data and data keeps moving through and product keeps moving out.
Dr. Bickle, I'm interested in your perspective on clinicians becoming technologists. Children's has the informatics fellowship, which I think is a pretty cool concept, and I think it's been successful with the folks that have gone through that. Can you talk a little bit about that effort at Children's and maybe why we're seeing clinicians kind of straddling both sides of the equation more and more?
Well, I think they're getting frustrated with just being, typists. I think so. Boston Children's has developed a pediatric clinical informatics program. I'm one of the core faculty there. We don't see enough clinicians in our community that can understand that human and computer interaction is really critical to be able to successfully take care of patients. Right now, all this EHR stuff that's happened in the last 20 years has been sort of foisted upon clinicians, and it's been foisted upon clinicians for probably not always awesome reasons. Yes, the promise has been, look, you do all this digital work and we'll help you with clinical decision support. Well, the reality is I get a bunch of pop-ups. Not all of them are really useful. Most of them are not useful that say, hey, by the way, did you know this remote possibility of an allergy exists? Or, hey, there's a duplicate you have two orders of the same thing. Yeah, I know that. I actually intended to do it. And if you look subtly, there's the difference about how I'm ordering things. So the reality is what we need is clinicians who understand both sides of equations, both sides of the equation, so that they can tell the technologist, no, in the workflow, you need to understand A, B, and C from the clinical side, so that the alert that you eventually give to me is much more nuanced and much more targeted to what I need. That's as an example.
Great. Dan, you and I were talking earlier about, and you brought this point up a little bit earlier about these tools being used in third world countries, more at-risk countries. I'm interested in your perspective on, there are a lot of barriers to entry to even get to the point where these tools can be used there. But how do you see that unfolding sooner rather than later? Because there's less regulation in these areas, there's lots of opportunity, and to help patients that potentially never see a doctor, kind of how do you see that unfolding?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the exciting part of the field, right? I always think back in, I think maybe 2015, 2016, there's this very famous paper that was published out of some folks from Stanford where they used deep learning to look at, I guess, skin images and classify cancer, and they compared the performance of the system to board-certified dermatologists, and they said, our system can work just as well, or in some cases even better than these folks. Well, that's lovely, but in a third world country, there are no board-certified dermatologists. So while that paper to me is interesting, it's in many ways not solving the right problem, or it's solving a different problem from the one that I think is the really exciting one, which is, how do you put something somewhere where there is nothing, right? And so I think, yes, there's less regulation. There is less barriers to sort of being able to get data. And if we can solve the infrastructure problem that I talked about before, you can actually, I think, in the next 10, 15 years, see these technology democratized everywhere. I think that's the most exciting thing. I think that, you asked what does a company need sort of at the beginning. I think you do need a very strong technical team. I think you also need vision. And when it comes to applications like that, or just being in the healthcare space generally, not even necessarily the third world, I think there is great inspiration and great vision on working on these things. So I'm hopeful. I think we'll get there soon.
And to
I'm
this
hopeful
point,
too. Oh, go.
sorry, and to this point of the problem being very different, I think, at PathAI we have one project working with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and whereas the data we get from the first world is focused by far and large on cancer treatment, they have this goal of trying to treat childhood illness and childhood causes of death in Africa, right? The first thing you need to know is, what are children dying from? And that is actually a big unknown. There's not good statistics on what are the causes of death, right? And it's a lot of infectious disease. It's very different from the kind of pathology we see here. So that's like a big outlier in terms of the type of data we get from there, where now we're not trying to treat someone. We're just trying to say, can we learn from what happened here so that potentially better treatments can be developed? So. Yes, I think selecting the best cancer therapy would be far less useful in that context. Right?
Yeah, I'm very hopeful that with, especially in the last 10 years, the advent of this device is so powerful that it's an enabler to help us deliver better health care in areas that do not have as embarrassment of riches as we have here in Boston. I worry a little bit, though. You colored the fact that there was less regulation in a positive light. I want to sort of hedge there a little bit. I think we need to keep our patients and their best interest in mind. So yes, there's less regulation. Regulation may be okay in some aspects. That may be anathema to some people in the room. Maybe people are getting up and leaving as a result of that. But not pro all regulation, but some regulation to protect our patients is probably a good thing.
Absolutely.
For sure. And in some countries, whatever the doctor says is the word of God, so they will do almost anything a physician asks. And that's really important to keep in mind in some of these countries.
Well, there's also cultural barriers to consider as well.
Yes, belief systems.
Yeah, I mean, there's certain things, especially in sexual health, in some countries that people don't adopt certain things that other countries have done, and it causes outbreaks of diseases that have long since kind of left our existence here. So I think it's an interesting point you guys are making here. So, Katherine, can you talk a little bit about how your research might actually be applicable in a space like that? Do you think you could accomplish the types of outcomes in that space, making your own data sets and working with patients on the ground?
You mean in developing countries?
Yeah.
Well, I have a student who's now a resident at Boston Children's, and he did this project in Guatemala, and he wants to become a pediatric oncologist, and he was interested in a condition called retinoblastoma, which is basically a tumor in the eye, and the therapy for this, you literally can go from being diagnosed to dead in 6 months. It's really, really a fast growing tumor. And it's really easy to detect. Usually moms detect it when they are breastfeeding their child. They can see this, the one eye, the iris of the eye looks, you can't see through it. You just see it looks white. And they notice it depending on how the light is hitting it. Anyway, he went there charged with with his phone and an app that just looks at the patient's eyes. And right away, it's able to determine if the child has a retinoblastoma. And then the child, for the kids that were in rural areas, this was really difficult because they had to, they usually had lots of kids in the family. They had to find, other people that were going to take care of them, and it was a big expense for them to go to the main city to get their care. But what was really interesting is that we looked at the time that it took for the patient from a rural center using this device from the ones that were in the city center. And the ones in the city center had just as long times to get to therapy because they were going through so many referral hospitals. And it was absolutely mind-blowing to see this problem, because you would think that the person in the rural area would have a much longer time and a lower chance of survival, but there was really no difference from the people that were living in the city. And so this shows you that even though we are aiming to have these technologies, that it might have initially been designed for outreach, it actually would be really beneficial if you just got on with it in the city as well. And so I think there's a lot of potential for things like this in the future.
Great. So kind of thinking about, my last couple thoughts here. Let's kind of go down the list and have you guys each weigh in on what you think are the barriers that each of your respective kind of parts of the industry are looking to break through to make these types of tools applicable and helpful to impact patient care sooner rather than later.
So I'll start. I think the major barrier from my perspective is both sort of what I alluded to earlier is sort of unlocking the real clinical context that's all in these narratives that nobody really has been able to unlock that information. And I'd say the second area is the data portability, or the ability for us to be able to pool our information together. So, many of the projects that I work on, our first step is around standardization of our information so that we can pull our data together. That's been a long-standing problem. I know it's mundane and boring, but it's the only way that these algorithms have enough information to be able to truly, get as fine-grained answers as we want.
I think from my perspective, maybe this is a bit of overly optimistic, but I think maybe this perception that there are such huge barriers, at least in the domain that I'm familiar with, is maybe a little bit of an expectation that because deep learning works so well and was immediately deployed in the tech sector, the effect on healthcare would be instantaneous as soon as we sort of shifted our sights towards that field. But these things take time, and I think you have to. The requirements for accuracy are incredibly high compared to, if I search through my photos for dog and I get shown a picture of a cat, that error is relatively inconsequential, right? But in healthcare, the stakes are higher, and so you need not just the proof of concept, but you need this long phase of refinement, right? It's like this saying that you're 80% of the way there, but still 80% of the work remains, right? And I think that's true of getting machine learning applications in healthcare to the point where they're ready to be deployed. And that's going to take time and refinement and work on the deployment side and the infrastructure around these things, not just the magical data set and algorithm.
Oh, geez, there's so many barriers.
The optimist.
Pick just one. I don't mean to sound so negative, but one of the things that I do in my clinical trials is I listen to patient symptoms and the physician, and I capture everything in the real clinical setting. So there's no staging of anything. It's really collecting everything live, and we're trying to just fit into the spaces because we know how difficult it is in the workflow. And so one of the big challenges that I deal with is trying to translate speech to text. And everybody in the audience will probably say, oh, it's not that bad. I mean, Siri does it quite easily, and Cortana and whomever else, but it's actually really not there yet, that technology. And I was so excited. I got this recorder on my first clinical trial, and I was questioning a patient on their chest pain symptoms, and I put it through my computer to see what kind of kind of text will this reveal. And it was talking about Russian agents, and I was like, goodness, this is useless. So my big barrier in my work is to have better speech to text. Right now, even in our best algorithms, where I use specialized technology, very specialized technology, where we're using a lot of the lingo from medicine and the terms, and we try to add this into our algorithm right now, we have a 30% error rate. And in medicine, 30% is just not good enough. It's actually nowhere near good enough. So I have to abandon it completely, and I do everything with a human transcribing my work. And so that is a big barrier, and to try to overcome and have things, I'm thinking about the scalability, and I'm like, come on. But another interesting fun fact is that only of all the YouTube stuff that's out there, the videos, only 10% are closed captioned. And that's because it's so difficult to translate human text or human speech to text. So I think if there's any entrepreneurs out there, I have ideas for you.
Great.
It will also get away with that problem of this useless data that's sitting in all of our EMRs. I think that would really be the big door opener.
And my Siri has about a 90% error rate, I think.
90%. I know everybody's notes on the end, please excuse the typos and, voice to text speechos.
But I think this is an example of a quantitative change being a qualitative change, right? Despite the errors, people do use the speech to text on their phones. I use mine fairly regularly, but an error is acceptable in that context, right? Speech to text has been around for decades,
30 years,
right?
30 years,
but
yeah.
The error rate was previously so high that even for casual use of sending a text message to a friend, the error rate was unacceptably high, right?
Yeah.
And I think, again, further refinement to get the error rate so low that it's acceptable in a clinical context. It's not a qualitative change in the algorithm, but the quantitative change in the accuracy allows new applications.
It's huge. And for all of those who think, well, my Siri is not so bad, and it probably isn't because it is trained to you. When we have all these different speakers that are happening all the time in a clinical setting, it becomes a monstrous challenge. And that's why we are really suffering it on this end.
Yeah, we use speech to text at Boston Children's, and it's actually okay. But there's still error rates. When I dictate an 18-year-old female, it oftentimes says 80-year-old, right?
Yeah.
So
Quite a difference.
there's a difference there. I have been caught more than once.
Right.
Treating 80-year-olds at Boston Children's.
Right, yeah, exactly. It's really embarrassing when your colleague forwards you the note back saying, "Oh, I didn't know that she was 80 years old."
Yeah. And for me, I see two things. I guess sort of in the legal field, what helps businesses succeed is clarity in the law, and there's a lot of gray areas, and there's a lot of confusion in the law around that. So in the patenting context, people don't know whether you can patent software or machine learning anymore. It's sort of a very evolving area of law, and the lack of clarity doesn't help anything, privacy and other things. But I think another issue that's perhaps common to everybody, and I think that we touched on this in an earlier conversation, is a big challenge is there's not enough bodies to do some of this really exciting work. There are
Yes.
not enough people skilled in the data engineering, in the infrastructure, in the machine learning, in the mathematics, in the knowing how to productize these types of technologies, in enough experiences that people can talk about how they've partnered with hospitals and how they've deployed in sort of success stories. You know, the whole thing is so nascent that I think what really would just benefit is just an influx of more people, because there's lots of problems to solve, and these are the people who should solve them.
And most of them are not actually being absorbed into healthcare because healthcare does not pay well. So that is also another problem.
We certainly
I agree.
see this, right? There's
Just to be honest.
yeah, the talent scarcity is real, and we certainly see the salaries that Silicon Valley companies will offer to
Not
a talented
comparable.
ML engineer, ML scientists are absurd.
Yeah.
And
not comparable to the salaries in
signing
healthcare.
bonuses and this kind of thing, right? But I would say that being the case, I have personally seen applications and interviewed people who are coming back the other direction because they want to work on something they find more meaningful.
Yeah.
And you see people having 20% time at these companies so they can do something in their 1 day a week that they find meaning in. Sometimes people want to do that 5 days a week, and so they're willing to shift out of these ludicrous salaries to do something that has some significance.
But that's after the ludicrous salary
Right.
happened.
They've saved a bunch of money up. Right?
They have their 5 Teslas.
It's not just I have a PhD in machine learning that gets me that. Like if I have a PhD in like neural networks, man, I'm making bank somewhere in Silicon Valley, right? But to make all of these companies succeed, and you said this earlier, right? Okay, yes, you have some people who know about machine learning, right? But you need so much more than that, and there are not enough people to fill even those roles. So, we need everybody.
I think you touched upon a great point too, which is it's not just the machine learning technique. It's someone who has, I think, industry experience. It's someone who actually has experience within healthcare that can then take that tool and apply it as well. That critical thinking that comes from working in healthcare and then finding your way into machine learning, I think could be a very dangerous combination, which would be great. We're going to finish on a happy note, and then we're going to let some folks ask some questions. So let's go right back down. If you guys could give me just a quick, what's exciting, something that's exciting to you about this space, and also maybe a quick blurb about something someone should read a book or someone should take a look at a research paper in the space that would give them a little bit more depth in this topic. We'll go the same direction again.
Oh, man.
Unless you need more time, we can go back this way.
Start there.
We'll go this way.
I don't know how active of a research area it is, but I feel like I've seen a lot of work in it's sometimes called transfer learning, right? Or just the idea of customizing your machine learning models to particular settings, right? So that there's this idea that you get a ton of, like, let's just go to radiology, right? You get a ton of MR images, and you train up a system, and that's great. But all those images came from all sorts of different scanners, from different places, from different patients. But now you need to apply it to a particular person using a particular scanner that maybe isn't the highest resolution thing, or maybe it's actually much more sensitive than the data that was previously obtained. How do you adapt your model to work in that setting? Of course, to make that happen, you need all sorts of data engineering and things. But some of the actual algorithms that are used to sort of do this adaptation, I think are pretty exciting.
What is pretty exciting? There's a lot of things. I think just where we are, it's just bubbling. It's everywhere. Everywhere you go, you hear about AI, machine learning, whereas these were like pretty unknown terms, even in medicine. 5-10 years ago. Now there isn't anybody who doesn't know what they mean. So I feel like we're just at this really exciting time historically, and I feel like it's almost like this, curve, and it's going to, exponentially take off, but we don't know where we are on that curve. But I think we're getting close. I think we're getting really, really close. So I'm pretty hopeful that things are going to take off pretty astronomically soon.
I think on the pure ML side of things, as a former physicist, what has always bothered me is the sort of black magic that is the practice of deep learning these days. There's a lot of guess and check and a very large empirical aspect to the field now. And I think the theorists are starting to catch up to give us a little bit more of a foundation on which we can understand and maybe a priori predict what sort of architectures and changes to these models might improve their performance and give us sort of bounds on their performance on new data they haven't seen in training, instead of just having to do this all empirically. That to me is exciting, and I think sort of coming at that sort of problem from the other direction, this black art, and saying, okay, well, maybe if we don't understand it, we can at least automate this process, right? The process which was the remaining contribution of the human to machine learning, which was designing the architecture, choosing the hyperparameters, and so on. There's been a lot of work recently to do this in an automated way, designing the neural network itself in an automated way. Of course, you could say that the ML people could have at least saved their jobs for last to automate it, but I think nonetheless it will move the field forward to have some more systematic methods to approach that. And then I think on the application side in pathology, to me, I think as I alluded to earlier, I think it's useful to decrease error rates and improve efficiency and extend the reach of pathologists, but I think it's really exciting to be able to do something that can't be done before, right? So find new information in these images that will inform a pathologist better or select the right treatment for a patient that in a way that you might not have seen.
Takes out strong.
So I'm excited that with high tech and the things that have happened in the last 15 years, we now have a vast majority, almost a complete digitization of clinical care. That's new for us. So now it's up to you guys to start to unlock that. There's a large corpus of data that's out there to be mined. So I'm really excited about now at least we have the ability to potentially get that information. And I'm excited about the amount of processing that we have. We have capabilities now in our pockets that my grandma would have never even imagined possible, right? Imagine another 50 years from now, what it'll be. So I don't think we've articulated a lot of barriers here. I don't think most of these barriers are unsolvable. I think they're just work to be done. We'll get there.
Great. Everybody, thank you so much for your time and expertise. This was really great. We're going to take some questions now before we finish up tonight. And then I encourage folks with questions, we'll take a few here, but there is some networking outside after with beverages and such. So, if people rush the stage, keep in mind we'd like to get out there and network with other folks as well. So do we have any questions?
Yeah, I'm excited for questions.
Yeah. It looks like they already started coming.
Thank you very much for your discussion this evening. It's very, very interesting. I'm wondering if you have, perhaps the panel here can talk about a term which we're trying to impact in our jobs, clinical impactability. How do you train a machine to be clinically impactable, right? So how do you look at the data and then predict those who are more highly could be impacted through either care management, outreach, or whatever the other piece. The other question, perhaps you can answer, is also how do you create an application that's billable, that can be paid for?
Softballs, huh?
I mean, I guess the first question that comes to my mind, if I understand your description of impactability correctly, if you want to be able to, it seems to imply that you want to have something more causal in not just correlative in the data set. That's you would want to train such an algorithm with, right? And clean causal data kind of...
Or to ID causality within the claims or RX or whatever.
Right, so yeah, so then there's two ways you get at that. One is either to have controlled environments like a clinical trial, and then back out of that. There you get causality directly. And otherwise, the methods that try to extract causality from retrospective data they're not clean. And it's, I think, difficult to do that in a way that, you could find leads, which you would then need to follow up on with a more controlled experiment, I would say.
But if I could add to that, I feel like in a lot of the methods in machine learning, we're just really great correlists, where we're correlating a lot of data and we don't really test causal pathways. There is a branch now that is borrowed from biostatistics and statistics, pure statistics, that is called causal inference. It's a very small group of people who are working on this in the world. And there's, if I was to say one of my books, The Book of Why by Judea Pearl talks about a lot of these causal pathways and how you can test them in machine learning algorithms. He actually started off as a big neural net guy, and then he just expanded into the world of causal inference. But the causal inference hub, I want to say, is just down the street. And these are the people that have used many different methods, from observational studies in epidemiology and in clinical trials, which are not randomized, and they recreate randomization. And so we are now trying to use, I'm using these methods in my clinical trials right now, and I'm testing hypotheses in many areas. So that way I'm able to say with more confidence something about causality.
This is way above my head. I have no idea what you guys are saying. I'll talk about the billing aspect of this a little bit. In our state, and I'm going to make a political plug here, in our state we have yet to be able to pass a law that allows us to really appropriately bill for telemedicine in any way, shape, or form. So billing separately to be, hey, we'll bill you extra because we've used this ML application. Don't see CMS going there anytime soon. But if you support the clinician in getting a better diagnosis, a more precise diagnosis, a diagnosis that really allows me to better describe how severe this illness is, that's helpful.
Great.
More questions.
More questions.
Thank you.
Come up to the mic. Step right up. Here we go.
Again, thank you for this discussion. This has been great. I wanted to follow up with something you talked about early on, and that was a centrality of data to the AI process. And a whole bunch of offshoots came off of that: privacy, data quality, who owns it, and it made me wonder if the landscape, the balkanized private industry landscape, is not the right model upon which to build this industry. Is there a justifiable place for the public sector in this?
You mean like in an open source way?
Open source or governmental.
Or government?
A lot of these data, as I'm sure you all know, a lot of the information has been developed, at least in part, through governmental funding anyway. And I think the analogy would be the seed banks that were developed by a lot of the state agricultural colleges back in then.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot of the data sets that sort of propelled machine learning along, 80s, 90s, and in 2000 onward, you mentioned speech recognition, right? NIST was the one who developed all of these data sets. So when it is so difficult to sometimes get access to data because it's private and people don't want to share, I think there could be a really strong role for a data bank, if you will, right? In the healthcare bioinformatics world, that's been there, but also in more traditional kind of tech areas, speech, image. There's these challenges. They're often sponsored by government agencies. What they provide is a common data set where you can train your models from. So I certainly hope that the government would continue to have a role in that, because that would benefit everybody.
So there's this data set that I use a lot, and it's called the BRFSS, the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, that is actually run by the CDC, and it would collect health information main things. So they would have like a main central module, and then they would ask each state had the choice of asking all these other extra questions to the module. And it was about 500,000 Americans that composed this data set, and it started in 1985, I want to say, is in the most modern version. Well, the CDC just announced that they are pulling the plug and they're no longer collecting this data. And so sadly, this as an open source is going. The other thing is they were so concerned because one of the metrics that they do include in the data set, even though it's all completely de-identified, they have your age. One of the things that they ask you is your age. They ask a lot of questions, actually. And one of the age questions, when there's somebody who is like 80 years old of age or older, they pool all the 80-year-olds as one 80 or over, because we also have some zip code data, and we may be able to trace down, zoom in to who that individual might be based on all the other information that is populated in there. So there are some concerns, there are some privacy. Sadly, this is now going. So, I don't know. I'm sad to see it go. I'm really sad to see it go.
And I think along the lines of what you alluded to, much progress in AI and machine learning has been driven by public data sets. And for pathology, at least, there is the data set produced by an NIH initiative, the Cancer Genome Atlas. It was originally a genomics, originally still is a genomics project, but also they produced pathology data along with that. And that's been a sort of treasure trove for the development of deep learning methods for pathology. And similarly, there's a public challenge data set along the lines of ImageNet called the Chameleon Challenge, where they provide a data set of sentinel lymph node biopsies from women with suspected of having breast cancer. And it's a public challenge of who can most accurately detect metastases in these data sets, right? And the results, they've only done it for 2 years so far, and the results have gotten significantly better over that time. So I think that has driven progress, and those are data sets that anyone can download and use. So I think it is extremely useful. It's interesting that you bring government funding into it, because I know that there's a sort of not necessarily the best incentives for like an academic researcher who's government funded to just focus on creating data rather than papers that they get citations for. But the Allen Institutes of Cell Science and Brain Science both are private, funded by private philanthropy, Paul Allen, and their goal is not to get high impact papers, but to produce a data set that everyone can use and learn and test hypotheses in. And I think that's incredibly useful.
And just to add to that, a structured data set that we can
exactly.
instantly do something
Right.
with.
Right. Very structured,
Yeah,
and that's key. Absolutely.
Very key.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Got one more.
Thank you very much for tonight, for coming. It's been very, very interesting. I have a question that's quite personal, but I thought it may be relevant for people here as well. I'm final year medical student, and I love any kind of health technology, really. I'm so excited about the future, and I love it so much that I've been thinking about stepping away from the clinic and actually going straight into this. What is the skill set as a young clinician that you would need to be useful in that world? Starting with AI in this sense, machine learning. What do you think?
I mean, I know that maybe I can start with what I don't look for in applicants, and that is someone who has just installed TensorFlow, taken a public data set, and gone through the motions, right? I think the barrier to entry there is too low. It doesn't tell me enough about you being skilled. I think it's, to me, far more important that you start with the fundamentals. You should have a decent math background if you really want to be a practitioner. And learn the theory, the thinking that goes into the development of these tools first. Maybe in tandem with playing around and getting some real-world experience with them. So I think that's important, but I don't think that necessarily needs to be in some formal environment. There are freely available books and plenty of data sets you can play around with online that would give you that background.
I think as I rarely, almost never, see the same person speak to patients and do the analysis. That's like almost unheard of. And then you instantly have this amazing context and you have the mathematic background to do it. I think there's a big future for people like you in there. So I would definitely hang in there. I tell all my students, program, program, program.
That's what I would say too. Don't step away from that. If you want to take advantage of it, but do them both. Yeah, it's twice as much. Tough. If you want to be important, you want to be successful, do both. Right?
That's the takeaway.
Make yourself marketable that way and develop your own niche. It's
Having
really
those two things in one brain.
It's awesome.
You're going to retrain to be a sort of a machine learning guy. That's fine, but you're going to be much more successful in entrepreneurship. People will pay attention to you and your ideas when you're able to speak to both sides.
Their advice is correct. I am much more effective. I am, frankly, listened to more because I'm a practicing clinician and an informatician both, right? Having, just an MD degree, and you're being an informatician does not bring you the same level of gravitas as, I'm able to say I called a patient at 5 o'clock tonight. I'm here talking to you all, an hour later. That gives some gravitas. So keep at it. It's not that hard. Med school isn't that hard.
Totally manageable. We got it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Time for one more?
When three people say good luck to you simultaneously, you do have a path ahead of you. If I may speak to that for a moment, because I'm a clinician as well, and Dr. Bickle mentioned this, you actually have 3 steps to go through. You get the MD, then you have to do a residency, and then you have to practice, because all 3 of those phases are very, very different from one another. So I would agree with Dr. Bickle. You go through everything, practice for a while, and then you have real credibility. It's going to make a big difference. And you'll be able to analyze data sets like while you're talking to patients and things are whirring in your brain. So the fourth person just said it.
Go ahead, finish it with a good luck.
You want to take a vote? Should you keep on going to medical school?
As a clinician and as someone who has taught 5,000 surgeons how to prepare for their oral boards where they're given clinical scenarios without any information about a patient, this brings up something that I've experienced both in my teaching and clinically. I can walk into an intensive care unit without knowing any patient there and say, he's doing well, she's going to die, she's going to die, him, I'm not so sure, and he's doing well. And there's this huge amount of information that I'm acquiring, that I'm processing experientially with my own neural network that I've developed over time. And I would love, my students constantly tell me, I can't answer questions on my oral board examination because I don't see the patient. And if they ever say to the examiner, what does the patient look like? The examiner goes, I've told you. Words and the image and all that input just aren't there. Do any of you foresee a time where the machine can do this? You basically put the machine with its big lens into a room and say, tell us how these patients are doing. And the machine actually can acquire this data, put it into its network and say, that one's doing well. Just the same way Dr. Bickle said, the nurse said, this patient doesn't look right. She actually quoted vital signs, but I'm sure the patient didn't look right without the vital signs, without a temperature, without any of that. Does anyone foresee this time developing so that that kind of really fast response can occur?
Yeah, I don't think that I think given sufficient data and investment, any relationship
And a few decades.
any relationship between a visual input and a consistently reliable relationship in the patient status could be learned algorithmically, right? I don't think there's anything magical about the human visual system that does that. What I think we don't, it's harder to guarantee currently, is what you might do after that, which is to reason about it, right? There's that initial stimulus response of seeing something that doesn't look right. And then there's the reasoning of combining that with many other data sources and coming to a conclusion related to that. So while what I see in a shorter term would be a sort of triaging thing that maybe says, put these 3 people in front of the physician first because they look the worst, it's probably further out going directly from that to what you might say with certainty after.
Yeah, that patient last night, what tipped me over was I listened to her heart, and she was just a bit more tachycardic than you would expect. And she had this glistening on her forehead. I know you think I'm crazy, but she had a smell about her too. And I don't know. I struggle with this, right? I'm not sure whether I worry about this, right? I worry about how had my nose been a little more stuffy, had I just not, why did I pick it? Why this patient? Because she came in with diarrhea, and I see 100 kids with diarrhea all the time. Some of them don't look all that great, but why this one? I said sepsis physiology, go to the ER. She was on epi drip within like 40 minutes, right? She's still on oppressors now, a day later. So I'm less optimistic that we can go that far. I do think, though, there's an opportunity for really sophisticated sensor systems to be able to pick up, a lot of different information and hopefully nudge us as clinicians to one way or the other. But I'm not sure in our lifetime we're going to get that far.
Can I be optimistic then? Right. So I think you guys are addressing slightly different problems. There's sort of the problem of determining if somebody's not right. That's just a much simpler problem. You just have to say, well, they're not normal. They're outside of the bounds. But a much harder problem is then to say, in what way? Do they have sepsis? Do they have some other thing? That is a much harder problem, and that will take longer. But as far as monitoring patients using some kind of sensor suite to detect deviation from the norm, and maybe to make a prediction of they live, they die, I don't know, some kind of very coarse prediction like that, I'm not so sure the technology is that far away from it if somebody were just to try and build it. But the more sort of in ML speak, like the multi-class classification problem of it's this disease, it's this particular diagnosis, that's much harder.
I'm going to say I do not believe that a human will be replaced that easily anytime soon. However, I'm going to add my disclaimer. I feel like we are using the way kids learn language right now to develop our AI systems for speech recognition and NLP and all that. We are, likewise, an expert clinician is very different than the medical student and the early resident, where they get lost in a ton of information, just like our AI algorithms do today. So if we were to use a progression of learning of how do you go from that to the expert, I think there's a journey, just like there is in our human capabilities as well. So maybe I'm going to hold a little ray of hope, but I think that it would follow that kind of a progression because, frankly, there's no medical student that's going to be able to walk through there and do that, or a resident, an early resident.
And yet when people say, well, how do you know that? I'm able to start identifying particular pieces of information. Oh, this patient, sorry, I'm going to talk medically for a few moments. That patient, yeah, he's intubated, but he's on a T-piece, he's breathing comfortably, he's relaxed, he opens his eyes, he looks around, he's not sweating, he doesn't have labored breathing, his respiratory rate is normal. But I picked all that up in a matter of a split second. And then the other patient is trached, has a G-tube, has multiple drips, has TPN, all this other stuff is going. That patient has multi-system failure, they're not going to do well. So I'm gathering all this information very quickly. And then there's that experiential component, as you said. The medical student is just going to see everything and not be able to parse it out and apply prioritization and significance to, intubation or not a trach and a G-tube versus simply an endotracheal tube. They're not going to know the difference.
I'll tell you what, though, if our AI systems can get as good as a third-year medical student, that's progress. Right? Yeah. Some progress. Yeah.
There's hope for our student in the audience.
And I think it's interesting that you identify that these are sort of two separate processes. The initial recognition process and then the explanation is actually second. It's not, they're not immediately coupled, right? Mm-hmm. And I think this is something that is underappreciated about machine learning, especially deep learning, where you actually have to invest time in that interpretation step. And it's not that it's impossible. Many people think of these things as black boxes. It's just that people are very rarely taking the time to go to the links of producing an explanation along with the prediction. But you have to do that as a human as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I think it's a good time to migrate out and network, enjoy the rest of the evening, and I just want to thank our guests again tonight.
Thank you too, everyone.
Thank you so much for coming.
coming.